This is quite a contradiction almost of readings, isn't it? We have the reading from Matthew 21, and then we have the Passion narrative in Matthew 27. So let's first take a few minutes and kind of talk about Matthew 21 and the procession of Jesus entering in to Jerusalem. How do we understand, like, what's the context of this event?
This is the Passover festival, I think, in Jerusalem. So the crowd would be preparing and gathering in Jerusalem for the big Passover feast, celebrating the Passover from Exodus, when the sacrificial lamb was sacrificed to lead to celebrate the freedom from Egypt.
Yeah. So every household had to prepare a lamb. If you lived close, you would probably have brought a lamb with you that you had loved. But if you were far away, you likely would have had to buy a lamb. And from what we know from history, it's this day that the procession of the lambs went in to the temple so that families who had traveled could get their lamb, and so they could learn to love this lamb over the next couple of course of days before they had to offer this lamb.
Yeah, it's interesting you say you get to love him, because that is so intriguing that we see those parallels then with Jesus and being the lamb. And this started all the way back in Exodus. I mean, the parallels throughout the Bible on this is just astonishing. So, it's always stood out of me that it's quite a feast, actually.
Yeah, because this sacrificial lamb of the Passover was a meal which was celebrated through this Seder meal on Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
Should we be able to gather? No. Eating at home.
Yeah, it's this whole notion of a lamb being offered as a sacrifice of thanksgiving, as well as a sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins for the past year. This lamb that was offered was not just for one thing, it was for the culmination of a year's worth of worship. And this lamb was significant. It's just...
Yeah, wiping the slate clean is what comes to mind for me. So.
And it's a celebration of freedom.
Yes.
From bondage to Egypt.
So here we have Jesus riding on a donkey, probably after the procession of the lambs. The streets are filled with the remnants of what happens after you've run a herd through or a flock of sheep.
Yes.
And then you have a kind of an understanding, well, why would they throw down cloaks and palm branches? They strawed the path to make it clean for him.
The street was dirty.
The street was dirty.
Yeah. And this is a fulfillment of a prophetic word from in the Old Testament as well, where Jesus would come riding into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey.
Mm-hmm. And that's how an emissary of peace always arrived in a city. It's on a donkey. An emissary of war always entered on a stallion. So it's interesting to think about Jesus, the Lamb of God, entering Jerusalem as an emissary of peace.
Yeah. But not any donkey either. It's a donkey that never had been ridden, which only highlights the cleanliness of Jesus in his approach or in his journey at that point. So.
And we get an act of obedience on the behalf of the disciples as well. Jesus tells the disciples to go into the village, and there will be a colt there and a donkey tied up, and that the owner will allow them to take it and that's
with
quite
with the words,
challenging.
the Lord needs it.
Quite challenging to step out in that kind of faith that there will be a donkey where he told them, and to act on that word from the Lord in obedience. And then, of course, the people who owned the donkeys, they hadn't actually been told by Jesus that they would have to release their donkey, and yet that calling was on them. They knew, okay, it's for Jesus. We'll release the donkeys and you can take them away.
Yeah. So they were preparing for just a regular Passover. Mm-hmm. That's what they had. They still didn't kind of really understand what Jesus was up to.
Yes.
But I think oftentimes we're like that. We don't really know what Jesus is up to. And it's sometimes hard to trust him just to do what he asks us to do. We don't know what being obedient will lead to. Mm-hmm. And so often I like to know, well, if I do this, then this will happen and this will happen, right?
Yep.
The disciples, they go get the donkey and then prepare the room for the Passover, not yet knowing all that God is going to accomplish. It's kind of encouraging as we think about this time that we're in right now. How are we being obedient to God's leading us, not knowing exactly what it's going to look like? And then, of course, we come to the reading of the Passion with Jesus in front of Pilate, and then with the soldiers, and then his crucifixion with the robbers. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting exchange in Matthew 27 between Jesus, Pilate, and the crowd, and Pilate's wife.
Yeah, the crowd actually doesn't know that they're stirred up by the leadership at that time. So it's not even their voice that they're broadcasting, and so it's so true in our life too. We're so quickly persuaded with what goes around it. And then, as you say, so with Pilate and Jesus, and Pilate actually just says it straight, aren't you the Christ? And and his answer is,
you say that I am.
I think we often underrate Pilate, and we go into this kind of bad image on him again for being the person who sent Jesus to his death. And yet, in some ways, he was being obedient to the call that God had on his life. Somehow Pilate comes through as a very important person within Christianity. Other than the Blessed Virgin Mary, Pilate is the only human that's mentioned in the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. Mm-hmm. So he's obviously got some great significance to get his name into the creeds, which is a statement of our faith, and the gospel is laid out there.
So something in that has always struck me is that in the end he says, right, this is Jesus the Christ, and that is going to be pinned on the cross. Mm-hmm. And then they want to change it because they said, well, he only said that, and it always struck me that he stood by the fact, no, this is what I've written.
And interestingly, in other gospel lessons, right, we know that it was written not only in one language, it was written in several languages.
Yes.
And when they asked Jesus to change that, or when they asked Pilate to change, the chief priest go, can you, come on, you can't write that. Yeah. Pilate's response is, I have written what I have written.
Yeah.
In some way, I think Pilate was acting as the kind of chief high priest at the final sacrifice. Yep. He was doing the job, right down to the ceremonial washing of his hands, which the priest would have done at the Passover sacrifice, or any time he was coming to the altar, he would have cleansed himself. Mm-hmm. And at some level, Pilate was fulfilling that role while the high priest Caiaphas was in the crowd, inciting the crowd to...
Yeah, and his wife, Pilate's wife, of course, had these terrible dreams that she was frightened. And she related, so he had definitely say, well, there's more to this than what they say.
What about the releasing of Barabbas?
And you feel sorry for him that he was chosen to be released, actually. So
Was that the result of the crowd changing the mind, or was that a result of Jesus' love for Barabbas? God's love for Barabbas? I think, Jesus put himself in the place of Barabbas, who was a criminal, a murderer, a liar, a cheat. And I think in some ways I relate to Barabbas in this story. Not that I've ever killed anybody, but I have got angry at people.
Yeah, but God's purpose for this is to bring Jesus is in one way as low as possible, so that even in the eyes of the public, a criminal gets more grace than he does. And so he can even overcome that. Yeah. And that is, of course, the power of the whole story. So,
yeah, in a very real sense, Jesus takes Barabbas's place on that crucifixion day.
That's right.
But in taking Barabbas' place, he takes our place. So it always makes me wonder, what kind of crimes did the other two guys do? Like these are bad guys
who were crucified beside Jesus.
That were crucified beside Jesus. And I kind of always okay. So you're crucified, and you know your death is imminent, and Matthew's gospel has them both reviling Jesus at the start. So, these guys are something else. Like, even in their death, they have the energy to mock. And it's...
But that is also then based on that too. It is the world. We have sin to overcome, and we bring it, and that is also there's two of them, and in the end, one gets redeemed, and the other one doesn't, and it is another just a sign of you do have a choice in this. You have to reach out in the end, and it doesn't matter how you started it. Like, they're mocking them both, left, right, and center at the cross before that. So, and he's still the one will make it.
Jesus in his love even reaches through to that hardened criminal who's dying on the cross somehow.
Yep.
And makes sense to him.
Makes me wonder what was actually driving the two criminals beside him to revile him. And I mean, they're actually nailed to crosses themselves, and they're dying this horrendous death. And the thoughts going through their mind are to revile the guy in the middle, Jesus.
Yeah,
what's the driving force
think
behind
that has more to do with the fact that we only see, of course, what is written. But if you transpose yourself in a scenario like that, there's a huge crowd there that is doing that. And then you're quickly in just following the crowd. And whether you're hanging there, and if they pick on the one, so why not pick on that one too?
Yeah.
So I really see that, that the crowd, or the masses of the crowd that are standing there, that want this spectacle, they just heighten each other. Like, I mean, at Pilate too, they were easy persuaded. So it's...
And then at the very end of this gospel reading, we have the chief priest saying, and the scribes mocking Jesus, right?
Yep.
You said you could rebuild the temple in 3 days.
Yeah.
Save yourself. It's kind of a profound juxtaposition to what we celebrate next Sunday, isn't it?
Yes.
Even in their mockery, they are proclaiming the resurrection unknowingly.
Yeah, because it was actually one of the cornerstones too of having Jesus prosecuted. So.
Mm-hmm. It's a profoundly moving story that both the procession of the lambs and the crucifixion, I think sometimes we forget how bloody it is.
Yes. Yes.
And it's not savage, it's earthly.
Right from the beginning, from Genesis, the blood is required. That God, to cover Adam and Eve's shame in Genesis, he slaughtered an animal and the blood was shed to cover their shame. And here it's being fulfilled in Jesus as the final sacrifice of an unblemished, unsinned man, to fulfill that we don't need to live in shame when we have Jesus' blood washed over us.
No. And this is the story that we remember today and focus on the rest of this week until Easter Sunday as the Passion of Christ. Mm-hmm. Reading through it in the Gospels, reminding ourselves that Christ died for me.
Yeah.
It's a profound, profound love. It's nothing that I can do. And may we all receive that forgiveness like that thief who mocked him, made fun of Jesus. May we all have that turnaround in our life to be able to receive that grace, that mercy, that love.
The same love that freed Barabbas.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
It was good.